Hello, Kate here. Before we get started, we have a quick parish notice on spoilers. We have worked really hard to keep our discussion spoiler-free, but this is book club and we are discussing the books in some detail. If you haven't read these books and want to come to them completely fresh, then go and read them and come back to us to enjoy our discussion. If you're ready to listen on, let's start the show. Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
We love a special episode on this podcast. And today it's the turn of the 2021 Women's Prize. We're going to discuss and debate each of this year's 6 shortlisted titles with our special guests, Elizabeth Morris and Sarah Oliver, both returning to the show.
Elizabeth has worked in publishing and events management for Waterstones and is currently creator of the book's newsletter Crib Notes, aimed at new and busy mothers, while Sarah is a veteran prize reader, having previously appeared on our 2020 Booker Prize show. We're delighted to have them both back with us again.
The books on the shortlist and up for discussion today are Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller, The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett, Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood.
This year's judges are chaired by Bernadine Evaristo, and she is joined by Elizabeth Day, podcaster, author and journalist, Vic Hope, TV and radio presenter, Nazreen Malik, Guardian columnist and writer, and Sarah Jane Mee, Sky News presenter and broadcaster. What are the judges looking for? They say originality, writers who have an unusual story to tell or an unusual perspective, books that stay with you, books that you can't stop thinking about, and books that speak to women as we are right now.
But have they succeeded? Did these books speak to us? What did we make of them? And crucially, which one do we think should win? Keep listening to find out.
Elizabeth and Sarah, it is so nice to have you back. Welcome.
Hello.
Now, we set up a little WhatsApp chat, because we've been reading these books for a while, haven't we? And we set up a little group to keep in touch. And there was a slightly startling revelation when I commented that I felt like I needed to read some books by men to offset all these books by women. And Elizabeth, you commented that you only read books by women.
I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just gradually over the years. It just started to be a thing that happened around 2016. And then I noticed, and then I thought about it, and I was like, well, yeah, I sort of feel like most books by men are superfluous. I mean, as I say, that's incredibly crass, but it sort of felt like I had just spent so much time at university and when I used to work in publishing, reading loads of books by white establishment men. Then I just gradually got into this groove of really only reading women. And now I sort of think, if I'm going to read a book by an establishment male, that's a book by a different author. Maybe it's a writer of colour, maybe it's a non-binary writer. I'm reading the establishment male instead of the other author if I make that decision, if that makes sense. And I only have a finite time for reading.
This came up recently for Laura and me when we were discussing The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which we both like very much, but Laura's comment was, if you can only get through so many books, should this be one of them? It's quite helpful in kind of winnowing out. Yes. And Sarah, how do you feel about reading male writers? Is it something that you consider when you're selecting what to read next? Is it something you think about?
Absolutely. I do read male writers. I do think about balancing it out with female writers. I majored in English literature, and most of what I was assigned were male writers. So I do think if you just go by who's won awards, or if you go by the canon, if you want old literature, you're usually handed male writers. So I think it's good to consider female writers, to be thinking about that. But I think it's really important to consider the person and who you're sitting with and listening to for however many hours it takes to read the piece. I love Michael Faber. He writes wonderful women characters. And lots of male writers can write great female stories, just as female writers can do the same for male characters.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? You look at Tolstoy, you read Anna Karenina, and you think, how can he have known all this? I realised thinking about it, I didn't know that much about the Women's Prize, and I thought it might be nice to start just with a little bit of context. It was set up by a group of women originally, of whom one was the author, Kate Moss. She wrote a little piece on their website about how they got started. In January 1992, a diverse group of journalists, reviewers, agents, publishers, librarians, booksellers, male and female, gathered together in a flat in London. The Booker Prize shortlist of 1991 had included no women at all, something which had escaped notice until the press commented on it, and the group decided to meet to talk about it. Did it matter that there were no novels by women? If so, why? And what could or should be done? There were long debates about the value or purposes of literary awards, of how they supported or inhibited reading, how publishing and reviewing might play a positive role in ensuring a wider range of authors and books were celebrated. After some hours and several bottles of wine, we had the idea of setting up a new kind of literary prize. One which would celebrate women's creativity, one that would be truly international, one that would have a programme of educational, literacy and research initiatives integral to the prize. Everyone at that ad hoc first meeting was puzzled that despite the ratio of books by men published to books by women being 60-40 in women's favour, the leading literary prizes nonetheless often seem to overlook accomplished, challenging, important fiction by female authors. By 1992, only 10% of novelists shortlisted for the Booker Prize had been women. Did it matter? The group decided that it did, since prizes are an influential way of bringing outstanding writers to the attention of readers. And so they then went on to be sponsored by Orange, and it used to be known as the Orange Prize, and then subsequently it was Baileys, the Baileys Prize, and now they're jointly sponsored by Baileys and NatWest Bank, and it's known as the Women's Prize for Fiction. Last year, they celebrated their 25th anniversary, and I think it's fair to say that they are going from strength to strength. The key criteria of the prize are accessibility, originality, and excellence in writing. It's open to any woman writing in English, whatever her nationality, country of residence, age, or subject matter. Submissions come from publishers who are allowed to nominate up to 2 titles per imprint, and the books must have been published in the UK. The winner receives a cheque for £30,000 and a limited edition bronze statue known as a Bessie. Is it still relevant today? Do we think there needs to be a separate prize for women's fiction? Elizabeth?
I really love the Women's Prize. I think that the prize is relevant as long as it evolves alongside how we think about feminism. So I think it was really important that Tori Peters, the trans writer, was on the list this year. And last time they had a non-binary writer. But I still think the writers who are recognised are predominantly men. So I do feel that the prize is still relevant.
I was reflecting that it was perhaps in no small part due to them and their work that it seemed to me there was a less obvious need for it now. But I was thinking, well, that's because it feels so much more equal now. It feels like there's this tidal wave of brilliant women writers and that these books are being championed and celebrated. But it's thanks to that work that we're now, I think, in this quite a different literary landscape, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think was a really important key move for them was dropping the sponsorship name. Women's Prize with the lime green logo. It's like, yeah, women are writing these bold, groundbreaking stories. So I do feel in the last couple of years particularly, it does feel like it is really putting new female writers out there.
All right, let us turn our attention to the thing that listeners are waiting for, the books.
The very first book on our list is Unsettled Ground by British author Clare Fuller. This is Clare's 4th book, and it tells the story of twins Jeannie and Julius, who live with their elderly mother Dot in a tumble-down farm cottage. It is a hand-to-mouth existence, as they live off the vegetables that Dot and Jeannie grow, while Julius works as a manual labourer doing whatever work comes his way. They don't have much, but they have each other, their home, and the music they play together. But when Dot dies, the everyday existence of the twins becomes threatened. How will they afford to keep the roof over their heads? Jeannie's heart condition prevented her from finishing school, and she has no job prospects. Julius has plans and projects, but they are impractical. Worse, the twins gradually become aware of a web of secrets surrounding their mother and the cottage that they have lived in all their lives. The publishers call it a portrait of life on the fringes of society that explores with dazzling emotional power how we can build our lives on broken foundations and spin light from darkness.
Sarah and Elizabeth, you read this one with me. I hadn't actually read any of her previous books, and this felt very accomplished, very assured writing. I felt very at ease slipping into the pages of this novel. It really carried me away. What did you make of it, Elizabeth?
I agree with you. it's an effortless experience and you just trust the author, don't you? I was pulled into this from the very first page. As you say, it's very atmospheric. It just pulls you along. It gets under your skin. I very much enjoyed it.
And Sarah, how about you?
I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. The story does pull you along. She's very purposeful in where she takes the reader. On the cover, it's reviewed as a latter-day Rebecca, and I didn't get that sense. There's not a turn in suspense until much later, and then that doesn't take up all that much time, and there's still a lot of, why did that happen? So I wouldn't be moved to read another one, I guess, is what I would say, but it wasn't bad at all.
Did you find it compulsive?
It doesn't sound like she did.
I found it compulsive.
I did think it had a really compulsive quality to it, even though I didn't necessarily like the way it was going, because it's very dark. It's one of those books that had that sense of creeping dread.
Yeah.
I thought, whatever happens next, it's not going to be good. But I couldn't wait to find out what happened.
Yeah, I was the same. But I feel like it comes out of the darkness and morphs into something quite beautiful and hopeful. And I didn't necessarily see that coming. And then when it did happen, I liked that a lot because it wasn't tipping into being sentimental.
No, you're compelled by this mystery, right? You know, Dot, after she dies, has not told her children something. I did have a tough time with how they're treated in the community, the way that the other characters treated them. It just seemed so harsh as to not be believable. I was like, how do they have no friends? How resist the people they know? I could never fathom doing that to some bereaved person. These are protagonists in their 50s. I mean, the way that we're describing them sounds like they're 12, but they are adults.
I thought the death of the mother, which is dealt with very early on, was extraordinary. I thought
I agree.
she
It was
wrote
brilliant.
about that so beautifully.
Because it's the first couple pages that I had to stop, because it is compelling and it is an easy read and it is effortless on the reader, except for right around the time that Dot dies. And I found myself thinking, what has happened? And then when you find out, it makes complete sense why that part is jumbled.
That's intriguing.
It is a really intriguing book.
Yeah.
It sounds like you guys think it could be a contender to win the prize.
I mean, it was a really good novel.
I don't think it stays with you in the way that some of the others might. Like, you don't finish the book and really stay in it because it does tie it up at the end.
I agree with you. And I think it's tonally quite an interesting choice compared to a lot of other women's prize shortlisted books, because there's a quietness to it. Even though there's this creeping dread and all these things happening, there's a quietness. It's just so assured. It's, as you say, Kate, a very good novel. It doesn't seem to transcend that. For me, it didn't anyway. I really enjoyed it, but it didn't give me more. I wasn't running out into the street telling everyone they had to read it because it would change their life. And I think that for me, a winner probably does need to do that.
So that's our standard then.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We need to move it along.
Yeah, because the problem is we could have a full book club about any one of these books, couldn't we? So yes, Laura, keep us moving.
This one feels like an old friend. It's The Vanishing Half by American author Brit Bennett. Both my book club and Kate's book club read it last summer, and we have a podcast episode devoted to it. Elizabeth, you also read this one. That said, before we get into the discussion, Kate, do you want to sum it up?
The Veens, twin sisters, will always be identical. But after growing up together in a small, southern, black community and running away at age 16, it's not just the shape of their daily lives that's different as adults. It's everything. Their families, their communities, their racial identities. 10 years later, one sister lives with her black daughter in the same southern town she once tried to escape. The other secretly passes for white, and her white husband knows nothing of her past. Still, even separated by so many miles and just as many lies, the fates of the twins remain intertwined. What will happen to the next generation when their own daughters' storylines intersect? So that's the publisher's blurb. It's quite vague, isn't it? They don't want to give too much away. It's a novel that spans a long period of time. It starts off in the 1950s and it goes up to the next generation. It's a family saga in some ways. This town that they come from, Mallard, is a town where all of the inhabitants are black, but they are so light-skinned that it's just a sort of bit of an anomaly, this town. They could pass as white, which allows then these two sisters this possibility of doing this. And it touches on this theme of passing and this tradition, within the Black community of people who have been able to do this. She writes very hauntingly about it. You never know about people who did it successfully because they're the ones you will never hear about. You know, they just disappear, they're gone, and the community doesn't hear about them anymore. So many interesting things in this novel. I think the thing I would say before anything else is just it's such a good read. It's beautifully written. It's a real page turner. You care about the characters. It draws you in almost immediately. It has an amazing sense of place. I read it when we did it for the podcast a while ago, but it remains very fresh and vivid in my mind, which tells me something.
I'm going to put my cards on the table slightly by just saying I feel sorry for Sarah that she hasn't read it. You know, it's such a good read, Sarah. You've got to pick
really
it up.
Sorry for myself right now. Yeah, I just wrote it down. Like, yeah.
It is a book that does stay with you. And as Kate says, I think it's a masterclass of storytelling. And it delves into these themes of identity, of racial identity, of gender identity, of love and class and family and the alienation that can occur within a family. And yet it does so in such a gentle way, maybe not gentle. It just feels integral to the story. Whereas I think some of the other books that we're going to get to, it feels like the fiction has become a vehicle for the ideas. Whereas here, the ideas are just a part of the story. They're like perfectly embedded and it causes you to think, but it doesn't feel polemical in any way.
I really agree with that. I feel like it's the seamlessness of the book and the fact that even though it explores things that are quite wrenching at times, the fact that it's so elegantly plotted and it unfolds around you, it's actually very accessible. And it's also incredibly deeply felt in the way that it explores prejudice and the shifting racial politics of the 20th century. I actually have to say that I sort of need to be strict with myself in terms of saying actual things about this book instead of just making enthusiastic noises, because I so loved this book. It was one of my favourite things I read last year, definitely in my top 10 of 2020. It's so compassionate and generous, and still you have this kind of trauma, this pain that shimmers through, but it's all handled so beautifully. In terms of the plot and the things it touches on, there are some allusions to Nella Larsen's amazing novel Passing, and it very confidently revisits that terrain. I love this book very much.
I was going to say it also nods to Toni Morrison's work, and I think it felt to me like a very worthy heir to that great writing on race, which isn't to be taken lightly in what, as Laura and I were saying, is packaged up as quite a breezy page-turning read. It's very cinematic. You kind of fly through it. It's got elements of thriller and this mystery about what's happened to this sister and then living with the secret, this lie. And there's also, interestingly, a transgender character, Reese. So she's looking at another form of identity that just adds another layer of interest and complexity to it. So, yeah, I think it's a wonderful book.
It's one of the rare novels where all the characters remain with me. I was just trying to remember all of their names. You know, the names may have passed, but at the same time, it's a rich cast of characters. We have these two sisters, and then we have their two daughters, one of whom is Jude and her relationship with Reese. You have Desiree's lover, her partner, her life partner, who's a wonderful character who has his own history and trauma, and yet they're all able to bring love to these relationships. As much as anything, it just feels like a really strong portrait of a family doing their best.
So in terms of winners, for me, it's a very strong contender.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, me too. I worry that they won't award it because it's so recognized already.
Yes.
You know, it's not really flying beneath the radar.
But it hasn't won anything, has it? I don't think.
No.
I think it was on everyone's best of lists. LitHub or something did a thing about, it was like the most recommended books on all the roundup of the best books of 2020. So definitely, critically, it's had huge acclaim, but I don't think it's actually won anything significant.
Okay, well, maybe that will play to its favour.
But it is interesting you bring that up. I wondered the same. I'm like, oh, you know, is it too obvious?
Yeah, well, a friend of mine who works in the industry actually said that she felt that it would be a shame for it to win because she said it's had so much recognition. And when you think about how life-changing really that prize money is to a writer, she said she just felt it would be a shame for it to go to Brit Bennett. I don't personally agree, but I thought it was a very interesting perspective.
Who would be a prize judge? So difficult.
Okay,
yes, let's move on
to the third book on our list, which is Transcendent Kingdom by Ghanaian-American author Gyasi. This book tells the story of Gifty. Brought to America from Ghana at a young age, she has grown up to become a neuroscientist. As a child, Gifty would ask her parents to tell the story of their journey from Ghana to Alabama, seeking escape in myths of heroism and romance. When her father and brother succumb to the hard reality of immigrant life in the American South, their family of 4 becomes 2, and the life Gifty dreamed of slips away. Years later, desperate to understand the opioid addiction that destroyed her brother's life, she turns to science for answers. But when her mother comes to stay, Gifty soon learns that the roots of their tangled traumas reach farther than she ever thought. Tracing her family's story through continents and generations will take Gifty deep into the dark heart of modern America. Elizabeth, Kate, you read this one with me. What did we think?
I didn't have any expectations about this one. I didn't read Homegoing, so I didn't come to it with anything. Her previous novel, Homegoing, a bit like The Vanishing Half, I think was critically highly acclaimed. I knew of it, even though I'd never read it. But so this for me was kind of a blank canvas. I didn't have any expectations. And so it was just interesting to discover this writer and this voice. For me, it was the one I felt most detached from of all of them. There was something slightly cerebral about the quality of the writing. I don't know whether that's because the main character is a scientist, which is quite interesting. She spends a lot of her time doing very complicated and quite graphic experiments on mice. So I felt, is that almost like scientific detachment that she has? Is that what's carrying over into the rest of the novel? You know, it sort of made sense to me, but at the same time, it held me back from really connecting with this character.
I actually did read Homegoing and I really loved it, and I think it's quite an extraordinary novel. It came out as a debut, and every single chapter is a different generation, a different person in a generation of a family descended from a sister who becomes a slave and a sister who becomes a concubine to a slaver. I think it's very hard to do that as a writer, for a reader to want to follow you through all those different voices. So she was already this kind of magnificent talent. So I was very apprehensive about reading this book. It's very different. As you say, it's very cerebral. It's very much a novel of ideas. And I started reading it on audiobook. I knew it was going to be a mistake because I needed to be in the text. So I switched halfway through. Until that point, I had that same sense of being detached. And it was only then when I had the words in front of me that I began to really understand this exploration of the interplay between religion and faith and all of these different beautiful things about grief and family trauma. I wish I loved it more. That sounds really strange. I can look at this book and say, wow, she is an audaciously talented writer. And I think Roxane Gay said, I'm actually quite angry that this is such a good book. And there is something intimidating about how talented she is. But I think I read it in the wrong way. I don't know.
I think you're being very generous, Elizabeth.
No, none of that is particularly articulate. But I just wish it had worked more for me because I do think she's a very talented writer.
So I wasn't apprehensive to read it, having read Homegoing. I was super excited. It was on the Women's Prize list. I kind of hate required reading, which is odd for someone who has a podcast and is in multiple book clubs. And so I was like, oh, great, I really want to read this book. And then it is so different than Homegoing. It feels like it's written by an entirely different author. I remember almost each chapter in Homegoing with such vivid recall. I only read Transcendent Kingdom now about 3 weeks ago, and it just is one big giant blur. It has a lot of similarities with The Vanishing Half, but unlike The Vanishing Half, you don't get a sense of this family as like a real unit of real people with their own personalities. It just felt quite cold. And maybe that was because our narrator is a scientist and she's dealing with this grief the best she can. But even she has 2 relationships through her work, and those felt very underdeveloped and cold. One of them is maybe a little bit romantic, sort of tossed in at the end. And coming back to what I said about The Vanishing Half, where everything felt the ideas came from the story, here it felt like Gyasi wanted to speak to the opioid crisis. She wanted to speak to the experience of race in America, and that came first. And sometimes I just felt like I was reading a graduate thesis. There were whole paragraphs that felt like exposition. And yes, the character was thinking through those issues, but it didn't work for me as a reader.
I was interested to see, she was born in Ghana, then she came to America and she was raised in Alabama, where the book is set. And I think the elements of it that deal with that displacement and that cultural identity of being from one place, growing up in another. I thought all of that was really well done. And it felt very true to me, almost in the way that it was sort of underwritten. There was so much about it that was unsaid, but it was all there. And I thought that was rather brilliant. And I liked the way that it touched on race, but it didn't feel like it was about race. Really, I think it was about the opioid crisis. But race was interlinked, of course. And I quite liked that balance about it. I suppose, if anything, it was the religious element to it that felt a bit overbearing. I didn't quite know what to make of that. Looking online, a lot of people were clearly, had high expectations after Homegoing. And it's hard for authors, isn't it, to have to follow up. You've written one brilliant book and then you have to come up with another one because that's what everyone's expecting. A girl in a book, 85, called it hauntingly beautiful. I was mesmerised by this book. Easy reading it is not. There are some heavy parts which Gyasi has written with such authenticity that I genuinely had to keep reminding myself that this was a work of fiction and not a memoir. I was so invested, I felt the raw, ugly pain Gifty experienced so strongly, at one point I put it down to compose myself before I could continue. There is so much covered in this book. Again, I have no idea how Gyasi has managed it within so few pages. The scientific detail included was astounding. I speak as a layperson, but it's hard to believe the author didn't undertake this research, and I particularly enjoyed the exploration and attempts to resolve her character's conflict of faith versus science. Meanwhile, Meg says, there's nothing transcendent about this novel. If you want to read a novel about a shy scientist who operates on mouse brains, rhapsodizes about her brother who overdosed on drugs, her mother, clinically depressed, who goes to bed for months, and life as the only black family in their section of Huntsville, Alabama, then this book is for you. The author tries to engage on themes of addiction, religion, racism, and depression, but it all comes out jumbled and incoherent. Chapters tumble from one time to one topic in mind-numbing fashion. I have no idea how the title of this book relates to the story. Skip this overhyped novel. That's very harsh.
Oof.
That's very harsh, isn't it? Yeah.
It does feel like a divisive book. I think people are going to love it or pretend not to hate it or try not to hate it.
From one divisive book, let's come on to one that I think is possibly going to be even more divisive. How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones. In Baxter's Beach, Barbados, Lala's grandmother Wilma tells the story of the one-armed sister. It's a cautionary tale about what happens to girls who disobey their mothers and go into the Baxter's tunnels. When she's grown, Lala lives on the beach with her husband, Aidan, a petty criminal with endless charisma whose thwarted burglary of one of the beach mansions sets off a chain of events with terrible consequences. A gunshot no one was meant to witness, a new mother whose baby is found lifeless on the beach, a woman torn between two worlds and incapacitated by grief, and two men driven into the tunnels by desperation and greed, who attempt a crime that will risk their freedom and their lives. How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House is an intimate and visceral portrayal of interconnected lives across race and class in a rapidly changing resort town, told by an astonishing new author of literary fiction. I was curious about Cherie Jones. She feels like the real newcomer here. She's from Barbados and she studied the law there, having a career as a lawyer before her writing career took off. Bernardine Evaristo called it a hard-hitting and unflinching novel from a bold new writer who tackles head-on the brutal extremes of patriarchal abuse. So, a powerful read. Laura, in the WhatsApp chat, you mentioned that you read it sort of, with your eyes half closed, holding it quite far away from you. Do you think that's the safest way to engage with this book?
I don't know. I think it probably deserves better treatment. But this book just cemented my self-knowledge, which is I can't read about violence. I just can't. We'll skim anything to get through it. Yeah. I mean, think back to A Brief History of 7 Killings. I read, 30 pages and just went, nope.
Well, that's interesting because I was going to ask, is it fairly recent motherhood? Because I think it's absolutely true. I remember myself, when your children are very young, it is very hard and very upsetting to read it. You just seem to somehow feel them much more keenly. But 7 Killings was before you had your daughter.
Yeah, that was a few years ago. Yeah, no, I think it's a consistent theme. So no, I'm not the ideal reader. In fact, I am going to slightly step back and say I'm not going to pass judgment on this one because my reading was not best practice. Elizabeth, how did you feel about it?
I never want to do a hatchet job on a new author, so I want to be respectful about this, but the book just doesn't work for me. And there are two main reasons it doesn't work. Firstly, it is relentless. As Bernardine Evaristo says, it is hard-hitting, it is unflinching, but for me, it just felt too much. And I felt like all of this brutality. I know it's trying to show us masculine violence and this awful patriarchal community where women are just treated like they're to blame for everything. But for me, it was too much. The title, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, and the blurb, which says that Lala, one of the main characters, draws strength from this story about the one-armed sister. So I wanted there to be some kind of female strength that came through. And in the end, it just didn't for me. And the ending felt so anticlimactic and tacked on. The plotting just does not work for me. I think the wrong things are revealed at the wrong time. Too much is held back at the beginning. I think it's interesting for me, the chapters that followed Lala. Clearly, she is the character that Cherie Jones is most invested in. That's the bit that's closest to her heart. But those are also the chapters that felt the most contrived. She just felt like a super passive character to me, and it just didn't work for me. That's all my thoughts are such a scramble, but I just didn't think it held together as a novel.
I'm slightly scared to offer up my thoughts now, because I had a very, very, very different experience with this book. But there was one crucial difference in the way that we experienced it, which is that I listened to it on audio. So the audiobook is read by Danielle Vitalis. And with the end of lockdown, I started being able to take the children to visit my parents and also my husband's parents. And each time it's a drive of about an hour and 15 minutes. And I've been doing it a lot recently. So I'd saved this. And when I was doing that drive with them, I would be listening to it, not obviously, but I should perhaps point out, not so that they could hear it, which might concern any people who've read it. Yeah, no. And I was completely enthralled by this book. Every word, it felt to me like she didn't put a foot wrong. It's so strange because I was so interested. I knew from the little conversation we'd had that you and Laura hadn't got on with it. I was really surprised. I thought this was going to be the book that we were all raving about because the writing, I thought, was so wonderful. Didn't you not think? I love the way that there's a very particular way that it's written. And I did wonder to myself whether perhaps if you just read it, maybe it's slightly exasperating, but when it's oral, when someone tells it to you, she writes in such a way that it somehow manages to contain the past and the present and the future just within the single sentence. And I was completely transfixed by that. I thought it was wonderful. I thought she wrote about violence so well. I thought about Marlon James, whose book, A Brief History of Seven Killings, is set in Jamaica and is spectacularly violent, but it makes you think of it because it has something in common in this sense of the place that we think of as a tropical paradise. And actually there is a very dark underbelly to life there. And there's a real tension between the holiday-making tourists, wealthy holiday-making tourists who come into this island, and the fairly poor people who live there and have to make do. And I thought that she wrote about that beautifully. And it made sense to me then when I discovered that she's from Barbados. I thought, right, you really know this. This felt very true to me. And I actually found, although many of the events in it are quite extreme, when I was listening to the story, it never jolted me out. And I thought what she did really well, it sounds like perhaps for you it was annoying, but for me I thought it was brilliant, was the way that she did end every chapter on a kind of devastating note that I hadn't seen coming. And I was just, the one thing I would say is I did love so much about this book. And of all of them, it was the book I liked the writing the most, I think. But she didn't sustain it for me. It fell apart towards the end. And I thought that was a real shame. I was disappointed. But this is her first novel. I think she's such an interesting writer. I thought there was so much that was wonderful about it. I can't wait to read what she writes next. But yeah, so it's so interesting how people can have such different reactions to a book. It never fails to, interest me. That I find it so fascinating.
Okay, I feel like that one might be the wild card then. On to book number 5, which is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Piranesi lives in the house. Perhaps he always has. In his notebooks, day after day, he makes a clear and careful record of its wonders. The labyrinth of halls, the thousands upon thousands of statues, the tides that thunder up staircases, the clouds that move in slow procession through the upper halls. On Tuesdays and Fridays, Piranesi sees his friend, the other. At other times, he brings tributes of food to the dead. But mostly, he is alone. Then messages begin to appear, scratched out in chalk on the pavements. There is someone new in the house. But who are they, and what do they want? Are they a friend, or do they bring destruction and madness, as the other claims? Lost texts must be found, secrets must be uncovered. The world that Piranesi thought he knew is becoming strange and dangerous. So this is the first book on the list that we have all read. Sarah, I want to hear from you. What did you think?
I found it difficult to get into the setting. I learned something about myself as a reader reading this. And when I think back to my favorite stories, the first novels that I read, like The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, a lot of those books take place completely outside. 100%, everything is outside in nature. So this book is the opposite of that. This book takes place in an artificial environment filled with, I want to know the word count, how many times they use the word hall and vestibule. It's obscene. And so for me, I found that really difficult, really off-putting. I couldn't be there in the place. And if I could, I did not want to be there. And then as you move along, a mystery emerges and that propels you. So if it weren't for a book club or the need to kind of finish it, I would not have gone to that point. But it certainly does change. That artifice is there for a reason. So it was also, I pretty much always read the physical book, but I myself was traveling and I had been thinking recently about Chiwetel Ejiofor's voice and how beautiful it is. And then I looked it up and he reads the book. And I was like, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, if I'd known that before, I think I would have listened to it too.
Exactly. So this is the first time I listened to the book. So that's a big caveat for me because I almost never do that.
Maybe that explains why you clocked vestibule so much, because it's such a distinctive word when you hear it aloud.
Yeah, because there are these endless numbered halls, aren't there? And the only thing that differentiates them is the statues, and he spends his days exploring them. And it takes a long time before you start to get a sense of, well, hang on, who is this person? And why is he here? You know, these little clues that are dropped. And someone said the mechanism of the plot is so pleasing. There's a kind of clockwork quality to it. Everything tick, 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 and gradually drops into place. It's interesting to me, talking about Homegoing and then Transcendent Kingdom, you know, I had read and loved, like so many people, her first book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I just think is one of the best and most wonderful fantasy novels ever. I was so pleased to be back in her world. And this is completely different, which pleased me as well. Nothing like it in many ways, the previous book, except for that voice, her voice and her way of seeing things and writing about things, which just felt such a pleasure to encounter again. Laura, you've read Jonathan Strange, haven't you?
I did. I read it a long time ago, and actually I keep thinking I should reread it. But as all our listeners will know, Kate and I are both avid fantasy fans. So when we come across very good fantasy, we're kind of thrilled. For me, Piranesi is the perfect reading experience. Like if I could transport myself, I know Sarah's giving me a horrified look, but I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I could see why other people wouldn't, you know, I completely get that. But in terms of fit for my taste, it was wonderful. And I do think Susanna Clarke writes with such care and precision. She's the opposite of prolific, whatever that is. She's kind of like the Ted Chiang of fantasy. She comes out with a book every 10 years, 15 years. So this is only her second. There's the huge Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. There's a collection of short stories, and then there's Piranesi. I wish she would publish more.
It was interesting to me that of all the books, this was the one with predominantly male characters. And in fact, the female character in this, although she's important in terms of the mechanism of the plot, she's sort of a side character.
Well, I would say that you don't know anyone's gender for quite a while.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah, you're right. It's also vague.
Yeah, it's really vague. I mean, I guess for me, I kept going back to other stories I was reminded of Oryx and Crake.
Oh, by Margaret Atwood.
Yeah. And I thought, I'd rather be reading Oryx and Crake. That's what I kept thinking.
Elizabeth, what did you think?
I can actually understand Sarah's feelings about it at the beginning, because I had a bit of an impatience with this book, mainly because of the word hall and the word vestibule. And it had this real like sense of it was just this endless cataloguing of all of these halls. But actually, then I realised how deliberate that was and how there's this kind of cool elegance to the writing that really mirrors all those marble statues in the halls it's describing. It also really reminded me of a lot of writing from the Enlightenment and Romantic period. It reminded me, above all, of Frankenstein, this character, Piranesi. He's this kind of Frankenstein's monster-like character who's such an innocent but has such empathy. I really admired all of that. And that was what kept me going. And then suddenly I had this moment where the mystery emerges and I was really entranced. And it is this exhilarating puzzle with these sort of Narnia-esque vibes. And from that moment, I really loved it. I couldn't put it down. So it was a really pleasing read to me in that I really admired the craft. I really admired everything that she was doing. But it also it's just so entrancing. I've said that a million times. It's so entrancing. I don't really read a lot of fantasy, but I do really enjoy it. And it was exactly what I wanted. It was everything I wanted this book to be in the end.
There's something else interesting about it, which is that we all have been through this very strange period of lockdown. Susanna Clarke suffers from a condition that is quite a mysterious illness, I think, but it makes it quite hard for her to function in a normal way. And she spends a lot of time having to rest and lead a very retiring life. She doesn't go out much. And in some ways, perhaps she feels, lockdown was a thing that was imposed on the rest of us, but for her, perhaps it's more her daily reality. And I thought this was really interesting, the idea that this character inhabits this place. Oh, it's so annoying because I can't really talk about it without spoiling the end. Can I say?
Don't say it.
Don't say it.
Don't do it.
I'll tell you what online Amy said. She called it strangely captivating and calming, saying, "I loved it. There's something appealing to me in the solitude of Piranesi's existence in this strange place, away from this ever more chaotic world, somewhere to escape to once in a while." And I felt like I just loved being in that place. Piranesi's character is already sort of fading for me slightly. The woman, all of that's fading, but those halls and that place that actually, Sarah, kind of like irritated you slightly. That was the place I loved, and I was so happy to be there while I was reading this book.
Yeah, I think so. That's the thing. I think if you
like being indoors,
if you like being indoors, you'll really like this book. And I think of that as like some kind of hell. Like
right.
That's what a hospital feels like.
Yeah.
The elements are with him everywhere. There's tides and there's rain,
But it's true. It's an interior space, isn't it? The windows only look out onto some kind of grey, featureless courtyard, don't they? You know what it comes from? Did you ever read the Narnia books? Is it the first one? They go between worlds. And there's a place that they go to by mistake. They go down one of the holes that they're not supposed to go down, and they end up in a place called Charn, I think it is. And it's a place of broken statues and this sort of featureless. And it was that apparently had sort of sparked this. And I loved that because it was tapping into this childhood memory, this childhood visualization I had of this place that she brought to life. Loved it.
Yes, it was nice to hear that from a woman because we had to stop reading the Chronicles of Narnia. And I just have to say, I'm reading it to two of my sons. And they were like, this is too sexist, too racist, too dwarfist. And and too royalist, because Lewis is like a super loves the royals. So we had to stop. But so anyway, it's cool to hear somebody who took that idea and went with it in a way that was not any of those things.
All right. We must come to our last book. Book 6, No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. A woman known for her viral social media posts travels the world speaking to her adoring fans, her entire existence overwhelmed by the internet, or what she terms the portal. Are we in hell? The people of the portal ask themselves. Are we all just going to keep doing this until we die? Suddenly, 2 texts from her mother pierce the fray. Something has gone wrong. And how soon can you get here? As real life and its stakes collide with the increasing absurdity of the portal, the woman confronts a world that seems to contain both an abundance of proof that there is goodness, empathy, and justice in the universe, and a deluge of evidence to the contrary. I really admire and love this book. Patricia Lockwood is a completely singular talent, and this is her best, funniest, weirdest, most affecting work yet. So said Sally Rooney. This is the other one that all of us have read, I think. It's another one, a bit like Piranesi, that's quite tricky to talk about without plot spoilers, as there is this big shift in tone and subject matter between the first half and the second half of the book. Basically, there is an event that takes place in her family that's to do with a child that has a very powerful emotional pull on her that makes her reevaluate her relationship to the portal. What do we make of it?
It cannot be a more different book to Piranesi.
Yeah, that's for sure.
In every way.
And once again, I'm like, how do you decide? How do you compare this to Piranesi?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I think going back to the qualifications of the prize, I think a book that is unique, it is put together in a different style, and it explores new current themes. And at least for me, and I think for most people, it stays with you. And so it really does tick those boxes.
Yeah, I agree.
I guess we can't talk about what the text is from her mom or what happens in the latter 50% of the book, which totally, even the format changes. But I really related to this book, and as a Twitter widow. So I have a spouse who's addicted to Twitter, just like, in fact, he's friends with the writer through Twitter. And there's a scene where she talks about her husband and the way that he has to like tap her, and maybe she has to look up kittens. I forget what she has to look up, but he has to get her out of the portal. They have this way of doing that with each other because she just gets stuck in sometimes and can't leave.
I had a disorienting experience on first reading this book because the reviews that I had encountered made it sound like it was a slightly parallel universe. It was talking about the portal and the dictator. And so I was only, I don't know, it was kind of like 25 pages in when I was like, oh no, this is just our world. This is just, the portal is Twitter. The dictator is Trump. I even like checked his election date. I was like, no, it's definitely Trump. And then actually, if you read the acknowledgements, there's a definite thread of memoir in this story too. Which again, none of the reviews had sort of flagged for me. So yeah, I was kind of on my back foot a couple of times with this novel.
So it's interesting. That was the thing I wanted to talk about. In that way, I would say, I think that it is not a novel.
It's not a novel.
Is it a memoir?
It's a memoir that she's changed some of the names. This is the most interesting, exhilarating read for me by a mile. This is the one where I felt she was really venturing out into new territory and I was so fascinated by it. But when I finished it, I was just like, what have I just read? And then I read the acknowledgements like Laura and I was like, oh, I've read a memoir. I think the thing that sparked that thought, actually, it had come slightly sooner, was I thought she is writing about this family event in a way that feels to me so authentic and so truthful. It must be something that she has experienced. And maybe that's a slight, almost there's a criticism embedded within that, in that I'm almost saying I don't think she could write about this well, because I'm not sure she's that, maybe not that good a writer, that's not quite the way to phrase it, but that kind of a writer to be able to tackle a subject like this well, without having that sense of experience. And then I read the acknowledgements. And actually at one point, it becomes a bit sort of meta. Towards the end, she's talking about she was asked to give a lecture at the British Museum. This was hardly deserved. She had, in a sense, stolen her way there, bit by bit, scroll by scroll, gold piece by gold piece. Still, she stood there and locked them in her mind for an hour. Her face was the fresh imprint of her age. She spoke the words that were there for her to speak. She wore the only kind of shirt available at that time. It was not possible to see where she had gone wrong, where she would go wrong. She said, Garfield is a body positivity icon. She said, Abraham Lincoln is daddy. She said, the eels in London are on cocaine. It was fitting, finally, to appear in that place and exhibit herself, and from far away, collage together in body and mind, monstrous in the eyes of the future, an imbecile before the Rosetta Stone, disturber of the deadest tombs, butterfly catcher and butterfly killer, soon to be folded between two pages herself, and speak about the liftedness of little and large things. And in the acknowledgement, she thanks the British Museum. And I don't know, the London Review Bookshop or whoever organised it. But, and I was like, oh, you did that. That was a real thing.
Everything's real. It is a memoir.
I like the way it didn't feel like she was trying to hide it. I just felt, it, like Laura said, it felt so odd to me that no one had picked up on this.
No, she just decided to publish it in a different.
I think, to me, this is a novel. And I think actually saying that things are novels or memoirs is becoming less important in recent years. I think that autofiction, that kind of weird genre that straddles memoir and novel, it's becoming a thing. And it seems like it is a genre that a lot of women writers choose. And I haven't quite examined why that is yet. I don't know. I feel that an author is within their rights to feel that they can choose to novelize an experience. They can choose to pull out the elements they want and to hide other parts. So for me, whether it is or not, it doesn't matter. For me, it's fine for it to sit between the two and to be called a novel.
I agree with you. I love a bit of autofiction. It made me think of Olivia Lang's Crudo, which is a really interesting intermingling of fact and biography about a person's life and then her own fictional gloss on that.
Like Rachel Cusk or Deborah Levy.
to me, having experienced those kinds of books, I didn't feel like she did enough with this. I really felt like all she did was changed a few names. So much of it just felt like things that had obviously happened to her and conversations she'd obviously had with her husband, and then these subsequent family events. I only care. If I had read this independently, this is the book. It is covered with post-it notes like a hedgehog. It's the one I wanted to talk to people about the most. It was the one that I thought really said something really interesting about the present moment that we're in, and it's had so many interesting things going on, and also the writing was in parts really beautiful and moving and memorable. And as I say, I felt that she dealt with the more difficult aspects of the story really beautifully and really well. If I had read it separately, totally irrespective of the prize, I would be utterly in love with it. I thought it was amazing. I just feel it's a bit unfair for someone like Claire Fuller, who made up everything in Unsettled Ground, or, Gyasi. Well, we talked a little bit about, that there were elements of perhaps her own story in there, that she had been born in Ghana and she'd come to America and lived in Huntsville, Alabama. But they were the only elements. Everything else felt comfortably invented to me. And it just felt like the weighting of this was wrong.
She's a poet, and I think this is her first memoir.
Yeah.
But
she has written a memoir.
Okay,
Study,
so this is her second. Yeah, but she's also a poet. So the first half really reads like poetry that was more than 280 characters. So it can't fit in the portal. And a lot of it's like that. It's that style. It's snippets. It's end of the day, worked on journal entries. That doesn't sound, I mean that in like the highest form. It's beautiful. I earmarked mine as much as you did, Kate. And I read so many passages aloud.
And it was funny, like laugh out loud funny in places.
I want to read this one to you because this one I thought was just, this one's so her and so the portal. Every day their attention must turn like the shine on a school of fish all at once toward a new person to hate. Sometimes the subject was a war criminal, but other times it was someone who made a heinous substitution in guacamole. It was not so much the hatred she was interested in as the swift attenuation, as if their collective blood had made a decision, as if they were a species that released puffs of poison or black ink in a cloud on the ocean floor. I mean, have you read that article about the octopus intelligence? Have you read how octopuses are marching out of the sea and onto dry land in slick and obedient armies?
So good.
Her words are just amazing. I think that's one of the things.
They are.
It's mind-blowing what she's able to do with language, the way she's able to pull out all these words like we're used to words. We live talking and tweeting all the time, and she manages to talk about things that are actually quite inane and crude that happen on Twitter, and yet give them this veneer, this kind of shiny veneer, this beautiful, gleaming, poetic spin. And then you come back to the fact that, but actually this character in the book is famous for tweeting, "Can a dog be twins?" And so it's this gorgeous language that's constantly being punctured. And it's so clever.
It's very clever. I wonder if you were much more engaged with that online world. I suspect you would probably like this even more. You'd be more part of the conversation.
I'm auxiliary to it, right? So I'm online adjacent. One fun part of the piece was realizing, one of the more big pieces calling Trump the dictator, right? But then there's all this, there's so many retelling of news stories, like the time she talks about two people of different races and different generations. One of them helped the other one or some as strangers, and then they meet up again and have Thanksgiving later. And she wonders, why do I feel so good and heartwarmed by this? And what does that really say about our culture? And I knew the story she was talking about. And there were so many of those just over and over. And I think in that way, it is the screenshot of our time that probably I cannot fathom my son reading this in 7 years. It would not make any sense. You know how Ezra Pound or just, people just throw out references constantly and you have no idea what they're talking about? Well, we do now. This is like how James Joyce should have been treated.
I read a line in a book about Virginia Woolf that leapt out at me when I was struggling to process how I felt about this. It's a book of her literary criticism, and it's from the introduction, which is written by Francesca Wade, and she writes, Woolf knows in her own bones how important a generous, open reading is, especially when it comes to the difficult critiquing of the people who are giving shape as best they can to the ideas within them, the contemporary writers, the hardest to judge, casting their net out over some unknown abyss to snare new shapes. We must throw our imaginations after them if we are to accept with understanding the strange gifts they bring back to us. And I loved that, and I thought, yeah, strange gifts. This is what that feels like, and it feels like I don't have the language or the vocabulary to quite process what I've read, but I love it.
I have spent quite a lot of time being extremely online, as people say. There's the blurb on the back by Gia Tolentino, who I adore, and I love her book Trick Mirror, which is also very much about the internet. One of the words she uses is humiliating, and all the other words she uses are right. But humiliating for this section of the book is so true because it's showing too much of yourself. It's like this mirror that magnifies too much. And then to come on to the James Joyce thing, in the same way that Ulysses has this kind of like winking audacity where it's like you're not even meant to get every single reference, that's what this book does. And I think you get so many young writers who are like, I'm the next Joyce, I'm the next Woolf, trying to write in this style that really captures a moment. And it often feels hackneyed. But with this, there's a real freshness.
Gia Tolentino says, reading Patricia Lockwood feels like looking through a kaleidoscope built by a mischievous sorcerer. The world is suddenly rearranged in fragments that are cosmic, wondrous, humiliating and profane. No one is talking about this as a furiously original novel, alive and unstable. Novel. She called it a novel.
All right, guys.
Which should win?
Yes, exactly. Which should win? Who wants to go first?
I would actually really like No One Is Talking About This to win. I really felt it was something completely different. It felt like such a miraculous book. She felt like such a kind of virtuoso as an author that I would love this to win. I don't know if it's maybe accessible enough is my only thing, but we'll see.
It felt to me like the one that wasn't quite like anything else. And it almost felt like the one that stood out the most. And I think in some ways felt the most original and the most challenging and the one that was grappling with the biggest ideas. But I would be a little bit disappointed if it won because I felt it sort of snuck in there, slightly under false pretenses. And I'm just not sure how I feel about that.
It's really annoying.
I know you do.
I'm feeling really annoyed
we'll see.
about this.
The judges may well be on your side.
You feel humiliated.
Not in this particular instance, but I just feel like it can be a novel. If it wants to be, it can be a novel.
I am on Elizabeth's team, and I too think this should win. I think The Vanishing Half is a masterclass of a novel. I think The Vanishing Half is a classic, and I'm not convinced that No One Is Talking About This is a classic, but I think it exactly fits the judges' criteria, and so I think it should win.
And I think Piranesi, of all of them, is the one I loved the most. But it felt to me, you know, in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, she does this wonderful thing where she has these footnotes, these very detailed footnotes that explain to you all of the different elements of this incredibly elaborate fantasy world that she's created. And the footnotes are wonderful. They're almost like little stories within themselves. And when I read Piranesi, it felt like one of the footnotes that had been turned into a story. I thought it was beautiful and I loved it, but it felt like a little side note. And so for that reason, even though there was so much I loved about it, I don't think it should win. I think The Vanishing Half, for me, thinking about it, of all of them, I think The Vanishing Half was the best novel. And it's the one that if it won, I would think, yes, I think that's right for me.
I would pick No One Is Talking About This. I do think that it's not a novel, but I guess that would be getting into the definition of novel. It doesn't really matter. I think it's the best written one that I read. And it explores our time, our collective thoughts, and challenges us. What she does in the second half paints a picture that is really, I find, really important for people to read. I think it's really important that people read that second half.
Yeah. And because we can't speak to it, we're only giving a partial portrait of this novel, this memoir, I think, right? Like the second half is all about our humanity and our relationships and love. It's very different. And that's what makes this novel quite special.
It's going to be exciting to see who wins. And I think, you know, what a shortlist. It's been really amazing encountering these 6 books. And I feel happy this prize exists to flag them up for me in this way. It's been really wonderful reading them all for this. I've really enjoyed it. And I love the way that then it makes the ceremony, you know, if you have done this thing of like reading the shortlist and really thinking about them, then the ceremony becomes a positively exciting thing in your life. You're like, oh, you know, can't wait to see who's going to win.
Thank you, Sarah and Elizabeth, for joining us. It's been so wonderful to hear your thoughts and your views.
Yes, thank you. We've loved having you on. Come back next year, perhaps.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great fun.
That's nearly it for this episode.
If you enjoyed the show, check out our website where you can find our archive of episodes and full show notes of all the books we've discussed, from reviews to recommendations. You can also check out our library of articles.
You'll find it all at thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter, which comes out on Sundays and is full of bookish inspiration for the week ahead. If you're keen to know what we get up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at bookclubrvwpod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. Were you jumping up and down with thoughts on any of the books we discussed today? Drop us a line and let us know. We always love to hear from you.
If you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate and review the show. It helps other listeners find us.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.